Hello, my darling, and welcome to today's story time. Today we are reading The Legends of King Arthur. Chapter 1: The Prophecies of Merlin and the Birth of Arthur. King Vortigern, the usurper, sat upon his throne in London when suddenly, upon a certain day, ran in a breathless messenger who cried aloud, "Arise, Lord King, for the enemy is come, even Ambrosius and Uther, upon whose throne thou sittest, and full 20,000 with them. And they have sworn by a great oath, Lord, to slay thee, ere this year be done. And even now they march towards thee, as the north wind of winter, for bitterness and haste." At those words, Vortigern's face grew white as ashes, and rising in confusion and disorder, he sent for all the best artificers and craftsmen and mechanics, and commanded them angrily to go and build him straightway in the furthest west of his lands a great and strong castle, where he might fly for refuge and escape the vengeance of his master's sons. And moreover, he said, "Let the work be done within 100 days from now, or I will surely spare no life amongst you all." Then all the host of craftsmen, fearing for their lives, found out a proper site whereon to build the tower, and eagerly began to lay in the foundations. But no sooner were the walls raised above the ground than all their work was overwhelmed and broken down by night invisibly, no man perceiving how, or by whom, or what. And the same thing happening again and yet again, all of the workmen, full of terror, sought out the king, and they threw themselves upon their faces before him, beseeching him to interfere and help them, or to deliver them from their dreadful work. Filled with mixed rage and fear, the king called for the astrologers and wizards, and took counsel with them what these things might be, and how to overcome them. The wizards worked their spells and incantations, and in the end declared that nothing but the blood of a youth born without a mortal father, smeared on the foundations of the castle, would avail to make it stand. Messengers were therefore sent forthwith through all the land to find, if possible, such a child. And as some of them went down a certain street, they saw a band of lads fighting and quarreling, and heard them shout at one, "Avaunt, thou imp! Avaunt, son of no mortal man, go find your father, and leave us in peace." At that, the messengers looked steadfastly on the lad, and asked who he was. One said his name was Merlin, and another that his birth and parentage were known by no man. The third, that the foul fiend alone was his father. Hearing these things, the officers seized Merlin and carried him before the king by force. But no sooner was he brought to him than he asked in a loud voice, for what cause was he thus dragged there. "My magicians," answered Vortigern, "told me to seek out a man that had no human father, and to sprinkle my castle with his blood, that it may stand." "Order those magicians," said Merlin, "to come before me, and I will convict them of their lie." The king was astonished at these words, but commanded his magicians to come and sit down before Merlin, who said to them, "Because ye know not what it is that hinders the foundation of the castle, ye have advised that my blood for a cement to it, as if that would avail. But tell me now, rather what there is below that ground, for something there is surely underneath that will not suffer the tower to stand. The wizards at these words began to fear, and made no answer. Then said Merlin to the king, I pray, Lord, that workmen may be ordered to dig deep down into the ground, till they should come to a great pool of water. This then was done, and the pool discovered far beneath the surface of the ground, just as Merlin had said. Then turning again to the magicians, Merlin said, Tell me now, false sycophants, what there is underneath this pool. But they were silent. Then he said to the king, Command this pool to be drained, and at the bottom shall be found 2 dragons, great and huge, which now are sleeping, but which wake at night and fight and tear each other. At their great struggle, all the ground shakes and trembles, and so casts down thy towers, which therefore never yet could find secure foundations. The king was amazed by these words, and commanded the pool to be forthwith drained, and surely at the bottom of it did they presently discover the 2 dragons fast asleep, just as Merlin had declared. But Vortigern sat upon the brink of the pool till night to see what else might happen. Then those 2 dragons, one of which was white, the other red, rose up and came near one another, and they began a sore fight, and cast forth fire with their breath. But the white dragon had the advantage, and chased the other to the end of the lake, and he, for grief at his flight, turned back upon his foe, and renewed the combat, which forced him to retire in turn. But in the end the red dragon was worsted, and the white dragon disappeared where no man knew. When their battle was done, the king desired Merlin to tell him what it meant, whereat he, bursting into tears, cried out this prophecy which first foretold the coming of King Arthur. Woe to the red dragon, he said, which figureth the British nation, for his banishment cometh quickly. His lurking holes shall be seized by the white dragon, the Saxon, whom thou, O king, hast called to this land. The mountains shall be leveled as the valleys, and the rivers of the valleys shall run blood. Cities shall be burned, and churches laid in ruins, until at length the oppressed shall turn for a season and prevail against the strangers, for a boar of Cornwall shall arise and rend them, and trample their necks beneath his feet. The island shall be subject to his power, and he shall take the forests of Gaul. The house of Romulus shall dread him, all the world shall fear him, and his end shall no man know. He shall be immortal in the mouths of the people, and his works shall be food to those that tell them. But as for thee, Merlin continued, O Vortigern, flee thou the sons of Constantine, for they shall burn thee in thy tower. For thine own ruin wast thou traitor to their father, and this brought the Saxon heathens to the land. Aurelius and Uther are even now upon thee to revenge their father's murder, and the brood of the white dragon shall waste the country, and shall lick thy blood. Find out some refuge if thou wilt, but who may escape the doom of God? The king heard all of this, trembling greatly, and, convicted of his sins, said nothing in reply. Only he hasted the builders of his tower by day and night, and rested not until he had fled thitherto. In the meantime, Aurelius, the rightful king, was hailed with joy by the Britons, who flocked to his standard and prayed to be led against the Saxons. But Aurelius, until he had first killed Vortigern, would begin no other war. He marched therefore to Cambria and came before the tower which the usurper had built. Then crying out to all of his knights, "Avenge ye on him who hath ruined Britain and slain my father and your king," he then rushed with many thousands at the castle walls. But, being driven back again and yet again, at length he thought of fire, and he ordered blazing brands to be cast into the building from all sides. These finding soon a proper fuel, ceased not to rage, until spreading to a mighty conflagration, they burned down the tower and Vortigern within it. Then did Aurelius turn his strength against Hengist and the Saxons, and defeating them in many places, weakened their power for a long season, so that the land had peace. Anon the king, making many journeys to and fro, restoring ruined churches and creating order, came to the monastery near Salisbury, where all those British kings lay buried who had been slain there by the treachery of Hengist. For when in former times Hengist had made a solemn truce with Vortigern to meet in peace and settle terms, whereby himself and all of his Saxons should depart from Britain, the Saxon soldiers carried every one of them beneath his garment a long dagger, and, at a given signal, fell upon the Britons and slew them, to the number of nearly 500. The sight of the place where the dead lay moved Aurelius to great sorrow, and he cast about in his mind how to make a worthy tomb over so many noble martyrs who had died for their country. When he had in vain consulted many craftsmen and builders, he sent, by the advice of the archbishop, for Merlin, and asked him what to do. "If you would honor the burying place of these men," said Merlin, "with an everlasting monument, send for the giant's dance, which is Killarouse, a mountain in Ireland. For there is a structure of stone there, which none of this age could raise without a perfect knowledge of the arts. They are stones of a vast size and wondrous nature, and if they can be placed here as they are there, round this spot of ground, they will stand forever." At these words of Merlin, Aurelius burst into laughter and said, "How is it possible to remove such vast stones from so great a distance, as if Britain also had no stones fit for this work?" "I pray the king," said Merlin, "to forbear vain laughter, for what I have said is true. For those stones are mystical and have healing virtues. The giants of old brought them from the furthest coast of Africa and placed them in Ireland while they lived in that country, and their design was to make baths in them for use in times of grievous illnesses. For if they washed the stones and put the sick into the water, it certainly healed them, as also it did them when they were wounded in battle. And there is no stone among them but hath the same virtue still." When the Britons heard this, they resolved to send for the stones, and to make war upon the people of Ireland if they offered to withhold them. So, when they had chosen Uther the king's brother for their chief, they set sail, to the number of 15,000 men, and landed in Ireland. There Gilomanius, the king, withstood them fiercely, and not until after a great battle could they approach the giant's dance, the sight of which filled them with joy and admiration. But when they sought to move the stones, the strength of all the army was in vain, until Merlin, laughing at their failures, contrived machines of wondrous cunning. This took the stones down with ease, and they were placed into the ships. When they transported the entire lot to Salisbury, Aurelius, with the crown upon his head, kept for 4 days the feast of Pentecost with royal pomp. And in the midst of all the clergy and the people, Merlin raised up the stones and set them round the sepulchre of the kings and barons as they stood in the mountains of Ireland. Then was the monument called Stonehenge, which stands, as all men know, upon the plain of Salisbury to this very day. Soon thereafter, it befell that Aurelius was slain by poison at Winchester, and was himself buried within the giant's stance. At the same time came forth a comet of amazing size and brightness, darting out in a beam, at the end whereof was a cloud of fire, shaped like a dragon, from whose mouth went out 2 rays, one stretching over Gaul, the other ending in 7 lesser rays over the Irish Sea. At the appearance of this star, a great dread fell upon the people, and Uther, marching into Cambria against the son of Vortigern, himself was very troubled to learn what it might mean. Then Merlin, being called before him, cried with a loud voice, "O mighty loss! O stricken Britain! Alas, the great prince is gone from us. Aurelius Ambrosius is dead, whose death will be ours also, unless God help us. Haste, therefore, noble Uther, to destroy the enemy. The victory shall be thine, and thou shalt be the king of all Britain." For the star with the fiery dragon signifies itself, and the ray over Gaul portends that thou shalt have a son, most mighty, whom all those kingdoms shall obey, which the ray covers. Thus, for the 2nd time, did Merlin foretell the coming of King Arthur, and Uther, when he was made king, remembered Merlin's words, and caused 2 dragons to be made in gold, the likeness of the dragon he had seen in the star. One of these he gave to Winchester Cathedral, and had the other carried into all of his wars before him, whence he was ever after called Uther Pendragon, or the dragon's head. Now, when Uther Pendragon had passed through all the land, and settled it, and even voyaged into all the countries of the Scots, and tamed the fierceness of the rebel people, he came to London and ministered justice there. And it befell at a certain great banquet and high feast, which the king made at Eastertide, there came, with many other earls and barons, Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall, and his wife, Igerna, who was the most famous beauty in all of Britain. And soon thereafter, Gorlois was slain in battle, and Uther determined to make Igerna his own wife. But in order to do so, and enable him to come to her, for she was shut up in the high castle of Tintagel, on the furthest coast of Cornwall, the king sent for Merlin to take counsel with him and to pray his help. This, therefore, Merlin promised him on one condition, namely, that the king should give him the firstborn of the marriage. For Merlin, by his arts, foreknew that his firstborn should be the long-wished prince, King Arthur. When Uther, therefore, was at length happily wedded, Merlin came to the castle on a certain day and said, "Sir, thou must now provide thee for the nourishing of thy child." And the king, nothing doubting, said, "Be it as thou wilt." "I know a lord of thine in this land," said Merlin, "who is a man born true and faithful. Let him have the nourishing of the child. His name is Sir Ector, and he hath fair possessions both in England and in Wales. When therefore the child is born, let him be delivered unto me, unchristened, at yonder postern gate, and I will bestow him in the care of this good knight. So when the child was born, the king bid 2 knights and 2 ladies to take it, bound in rich cloth of gold, and to deliver the baby to a poor man whom they should discover at the postern gate. And the child being delivered thus to Merlin, who himself took the guise of a poor man, was carried by him to a holy priest, and christened in the name of Arthur. And then he was taken to Sir Ector's house, and nourished at Sir Ector's wife's own breasts. And in the same house he remained for many years, no man soever knowing where he was, save Merlin and the king. Anon it befell that the king was seized by a lingering distemper, and the Saxon heathens, taking their occasion, came back from over the sea, and swarmed upon the land, wasting it with fire and sword. When Uther heard thereof, he fell into a greater rage than his weakness could bear, and he commanded all of his nobles to come before him, that he might upbraid them for their cowardice. And when he had sharply and hotly rebuked them, he swore that he himself, nigh unto death although he lay, would lead them forth against the enemy. Then, causing a horse litter to be made, in which he might be carried, for he was too faint and weak to ride, he went with his army swiftly against the Saxons. But they, when they heard that Uther was coming in a litter, disdained to fight with him, saying it would be a shame for brave men to fight with one half dead. So they retired into their city, and, as if it were in scorn of danger, left the gates wide open. But Uther straightway commanding his men to assault the town, and they did so without loss of time. Then they had reached the gates, when the Saxons, repenting too late of their haughty pride, rushed forth to their defense. The battle raged until night, and was begun again the next day. But at last their leaders, Octa and Ossa, being slain, the Saxons turned their backs and fled, leaving the Britons of full triumph. The king at this felt so great joy, that whereas before he could scarce raise himself without help, he now sat upright, all by himself, and said, with a laughing and merry face, "They called me the half-dead king, and so indeed I was. But victory to me half-dead is better than defeat and the best health. For me to die with honor is far better than to live disgraced." But the Saxons, although thus defeated, were ready still for war. Uther would have pursued them, but his illness had by now so grown that his knights and barons kept him from the adventure. In this the enemy took courage, and left nothing undone to destroy the land, until, descending to the vilest treachery, they resolved to kill the king by poison. To this, as he lay sick at Verulam, they sent and poisoned stealthily a spring of clear water, whence he wont to drink daily. And so, on the very next day, he was taken with the pains of death, as were also 100 others after him. When the villainy was discovered, heaps of earth were thrown over the well. The knights and barons, full of sorrow, now took counsel together, and they came to Merlin for his help, to learn the king's will before he died, for he was by this time speechless. "Sirs," said Merlin, "there is no remedy, and God's will must be done. But be ye all tomorrow before him, for God will make him speak before he dies." So on the morrow all of the barons, with Merlin, stood round the bedside of the king. And Merlin said aloud to Uther, Lord, shall thy son Arthur be the king of all this realm after thy days? Then Uther Pendragon turned him about and said, in the hearing of them all, God's blessing and mine upon him. I bid him pray for my soul, and also that he claim my crown, or forfeit all of my blessing. And with those words, he died. Then came together all the bishops and the clergy, and great multitudes of people, and bewailed the king. And carrying his body to the convent of Ambrius, they buried it close by his brother's grave, within the giant's dance. And this, my darling, ends our story time for today. As always, I hope that you have very sweet and creepy dreams. Good night.